Content inspiration. It's all about where good content comes from. It's how you can form a lot of these strategic mindsets and frameworks on how to build great stuff. But it all starts with figuring out what good looks like. So, if you were able to look around at all the different things that you consume from an entertainment standpoint, movies, music, paintings, arts, dance, any skill, essentially, any skilled labor, you would very quickly be able to discern what somebody who's never done it before or has only heard about what it would be like to actually create this kind of stuff. You can recognize the difference. You can recognize when a child attempts something versus somebody who is a trained professional. Without ever seeing something, how can you create something that is on a par with other professionals? And I find that this is often the case with anything related to work, hobbies, entertainment, arts, you name it. I often find myself breaking down into granular elements what good work really amounts to. Why is this good? And that comes down often to pattern recognition. You're discovering structure or a framework that exists within anything that is created. Once you start to be able to recognize and define the structure and the elements within, everything becomes a lot easier and it starts to build a mental framework and process for being able to look at something objectively and go, that's not good because some of my closest friends here in Denmark are architects. And one of the funniest things that they often are told is you can't just say, oh, that's ugly. You have to say why it's ugly. Well, it's because it doesn't have the congruency of the angles that don't really match. The aesthetic seems to blend too many different models together, therefore it doesn't work. Or the cheapness of the material really is obvious to somebody with the trained eye. These things are often things that as individuals we can pick up fairly quickly and recognize within ourselves and the work that we do. So, how do we increase the speed of quality so we can get more of that good stuff coming out of ourselves? And there's a lot of factors, some internal, some external. Looking at good versions is always a really great starting point in order to recognize why is that good? What is this thing that seems to grab so much attention and be so popular amongst so many different people? There's training. So you're sitting in a course right now watching an expert go over some of the different things that they do in order to make good or quality stuff. You can get feedback, and that can come in the form of active or passive. So you can have people actively giving feedback as you're posting and publishing things, but you can also reach out to peers and say, "What do you think of this objectively? I respect your opinion. Tell me." You can use better tools. Sometimes using the wrong paint, the wrong materials, or the wrong tools in general will give you a bad output. Ultimately, as I said before, time and effort play a huge part of this. And even if you're using not so great tools and not so great materials, you can still build something amazing and interesting and beautiful and captivating. You just have to put in a little more time and energy than the average person. And most people don't put in any. So it's not hard to get started. I often say that beauty is in the details. If we define the categories and elements, it becomes so much easier and clearer to really dissect what's happening here. What are the different category structures and elements that exist? Why do they exist? Then, like, the question is, like, well, when are these different things used? In what order does it make sense? And how are they eventually made? If we can start thinking about these things as we're putting time, effort, and energy into content, into projects, into anything that we're building, I think life gets a lot more beautiful and easier. Everything in the world can be broken down into smaller parts. And once you understand that and see that everywhere, I think life gets a lot more interesting and ultimately you get better at the things that you spend time on. So, this is why I often break down content into pillars, themes, and topics. The breakdown of these different categories allows you to see the structurally different angles of big ideas of content. Then, inside of these big ideas, you have these different distinct content subtypes or subcategories of content. And within each of these, there's different specific topics or subjects that you want to cover. Now, I want to break this down into its ridiculous elements, but I want to do this using a metaphor. So let's apply this framework to entertainment pillars. We've all, for the most part, I assume, we've all seen television, movies, music, video games, and so on. If we were to think of content pillars as big areas where one would be able to create a type of content, that would break down mostly into this. And that's what we're kind of looking at here is these different pillars. Now, this is just an example. And of course, with every metaphor, it breaks down at a certain point, but just go with me. Like it kind of makes sense. And I'm trying to prove a point. Within the theme of movies, there's lots of very distinct types of content that are more or less the subcategory of that particular pillar. So within movies, there's action, adventure, comedy, drama, horror, mystery, science fiction, crime, romance. I'm sure we could find other genres that make sense, but those are essentially the main themes within the movie pillar if we were using this metaphor. Then inside of that one particular science fiction theme, if we broke down movies into the theme of science fiction and we went into individual topics, I would think of topics as the individual movies that exist. And there is a big difference between Blade Runner 2049 and 2001 A Space Odyssey. There are very unique elements that go into each of those. If we were trying to understand how to apply this into movies and we took a very specific example, I chose Avatar. I'm not like a crazy Avatar guy, but I think it's a good example because this Avatar movie fits into so many different categories. And if you go onto IMDb and look up Avatar, it says the genre is action epic, adventure epic, fantasy epic, sci-fi epic. Like, and all of those would technically be true, but you just need to pick one. And that's kind of the idea here is to build your mental model of creating content with this type of framework so you can start to separate and build more. So how would we do that with social media? So let's say on an individual level, we want to produce a lot of different types of content. And so in my eyes, the pillars break down into these main areas. Now, depending on the nature of your work and what you do, maybe there's a pillar that exists that isn't listed within here, but I'm going to move into themes after this. Now, bear in mind, I have done a crazy amount of work in the background to really separate these out. So if you open up this link, you can see that I have broken down tutorials, and then inside of tutorials, there's individual topics. I've broken down explainers, and there's individual, themes within each of these, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, I've tried to do this across the board in many different ways, and these are all the topics that would potentially break down. But the whole idea here is showing you that you can have subcategory for subcategory for subcategory in order to kind of have this very clear map of what you're building. So inside of a pillar, and let's say we chose the pillar of listicles. Listicles are basically a list that meets an article. It's a listicle, right? So we're trying to come up with the idea of a theme within listicles, and there are many. There's buyer comparisons. There's tool slash tech stack slash lists of different tools that you use as insert your particular job title. There's checklists that you can do as you're building some type of project specific to your experience and your roles or the projects that you've worked on. There's different superlatives. Superlatives are like the best of, the top of, the worst of, and those can go into any type of theme or category or format depending on what you're describing. There's trends lists, the top 5 things that are happening in 2025. There's the newest things, there's the free things, there's favorite lists, there's resources. I mean, you could really parse this in so many different ways, but I digress. There's a lot of overlap, of course. So if I chose the superlative theme within the listicle pillar as an individual content creator, these would be just some of the topics. Now, I've created a massive prompt that would allow you to basically get everything done here with minimal amounts of effort, and I will eventually pull this up in the next segment, but I just wanted you to bear in mind that there's so much that can be created using this mentality, this framework, in order to approach generating content from your own experiences and your own role within the world or within an individual company. It doesn't matter how low end on the totem pole or how early you are in your career, you can literally break things down into this area. Now, eventually, if I wanted to build an article, I would have the same format listing out, let's say the topic was 7 best AI tools of the year 2025. I would be able to break those down individually and have the same information for each of them. And I would release it as potentially a blog post, as a social media post, as a video highlight reel, and repurpose for days. Now, I have already gone over lots and lots and lots of different tools, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time doing that here. I'll show you on the next one what I would do, but there are different tools for finding inspiration. There's different LinkedIn influencer lists where you can literally find the top people within your vertical and see what they're posting on a regular basis, the people that have the most activity that are considered thought leaders in their space. You can go into different groups and find individual groups where people are constantly posting and publishing and asking questions and engaged on stuff that is interesting to your potential audience or interesting to you. There's lots and lots of different social media tools that allow you to parse out and find the most active and the most engaged pieces of content, at which case you're able to recognize immediately, like, well, this thing has 10,000 plus engagements. It must be interesting to people. Therefore, maybe I can make a version of that later. There's PR and news search, which I've covered extensively. There's lots of different publishing tools that also allow you to look into specific channels. Some channels seem to gravitate towards certain pieces of content more than others. There's also, for those that do design, a lot of design inspiration sites. And for those that are becoming builders or want to build their own things, there's lots of places to discover new and interesting products, solutions, services that are coming from either solo builders or entrepreneurs or people that are really early stage. And it's super interesting to see kind of their journey as they're taking off and bringing something to life. All of this is to say, if you open up any of these, you can find out what good looks like very quickly rather than having to discern through really murky and unclear areas. Find out what good looks like on the channels that you are the most comfortable with and you want to post with. Personally, I'm a big fan of LinkedIn because when we're doing the job search stuff, I find that a lot of people are finding us on there. But that might not be true for you.